Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. I don't think morning in some places. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started here in just a second. Let some other people trickle in. Zach, I don't know about you, but I see some of my customers in the chat already. Hi, Tia. Hi, Caitlin.
Yeah, I think I see some folks. I know Chris, I used to work with, and Chris, you did awesome yesterday on the panel, so good to have you in here as well.
And please feel free to continue using the chat to say hello. I'm loving seeing where everybody is from. Cincinnati, Lauren Moretto. I visited right before the pandemic, actually, and I loved it. Where else? Austin, amazing. Hamburg, Amsterdam. This is great. Thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. We'll give it just another minute before we officially kick it off. As you can see, I'm Mari. Zach is having a little bit of Wi-Fi trouble, I think, at this moment, but he can still hear us and is very much going to be part of this. So we'll be lucky when we get to see his face, but he's here as well.
Yeah, it's probably better off that I'm frozen and nobody can see my face. So you guys are lucky this time. I think am I back? I can't tell.
Yeah, you showed back up. It's going to be a nice surprise when you come back in. So no worries, we can still hear you though.
Awesome.
All right, well, since we are at 1:50, 5 minutes past the official start, we will go ahead and jump right in. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for a session called Supercharge Your Content with SEO. Quick agenda and in terms of what you can expect from this session. There is going to be a quick intro for the two of us. We are going to walk through kind of a mock content assessment, similar to how both Zach and I would discuss content development with any of our customers and clients, and then dive into 5 steps that you can utilize to supercharge your SEO content, and then of course a Q&A session. So definitely feel free to drop questions in the chat, but just in terms of flow, it'd be great if we can ask those at the end as well.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go first. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Zachary Fukuda. I'm a senior SEO success manager here at Conductor. It also says there that I am a very depressed New York Jets fan. That is very, very true. If you've been my client for any amount of time, you've seen me either complain about the Jets. When I share my screen, you've seen my background is the Jets. So if there are any other NFL or especially Jets fans, feel free to commiserate with me in the chat section. I'll turn it over to Mari.
Thanks, Zach. And I am Mari Irby. I'm an SEO success manager at Conductor. My fun fact is that I'm a self-proclaimed pizza connoisseur, specifically within New York City. Normally, we'd be having our conference within the city. So for any of you who plan to join us once we are in person again, please find me. I'd be very happy to give any pizza recommendations within the city, kind of my top 10 list, if you will, kind of my claim to fame. And it's so wonderful to have all of you here with us this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the content that we have for today. And speaking of content, kind of the overall question, right, and the overall theme here in terms of what we really want to talk about and dig into is what makes good content. So I want to take just the next couple of minutes to let those of you who are either content writers or interested in creating content, give me your best pieces of advice, your personal best piece of advice in terms of what makes a good piece of content. Go ahead and feel free to throw that in the chat. I'll read some of those off. Amazing. Seeing some great responses already.
Ooh, Start the Voice of the Customer is definitely a good one.
Yep. Relevant. Absolutely. Absolutely. These are all great. I've seen relevant a couple of times. Oh, another relevant, definitely a buzzword. Customer voice, amazing. Yep, Tia, I saw that. We just talked about that. Answer the questions that your customers ask. These are all amazing. Humanize it, humanize it. You've been here before. That's great. All right, we'll let a couple others.
Definitely good as well.
Yeah, I saw that come in as well. Make it personal, amazing. Oh, I like this. Write content as if I'm writing to a friend. That's really cool. Quality versus quantity, solves a potential customer pain point. Another relevant. Amazing. Thank you so much for contributing these. These are fantastic. I definitely agree with everything all of you have said, and I think that also identifies why writing content can be a little bit of this black box for some people, because there are so many different ways to approach it. And one of the ways that we wanted to kind of walk through ways to really think about and conceptualize creating content is actually having kind of a mock conversation between Zach and I, as if one of us were the customer success manager and one of us was the customer. So we'll jump right into that. And again, thank you all so much for these really valuable insights in the chat. So in line with thinking about what makes a good piece of content, another question that often comes up is, why might a piece of content fail? So like I said, Zach and I are going to kind of walk through this like a mock session that we would host with one of our customers and kind of take a look at an example. So as you can see here, Zach, you're going to be my customer and a manager of an e-commerce sporting goods site, and I'm going to be the SEO success manager. So Zach, if you want to walk me through kind of what you're noticing, but recently we've talked about that you've created a piece of content targeting the topic of COVID, right? You really wrote about COVID, but you recently reached out because you were disappointed with the performance of this page. It was underperforming a bit. So can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, Mari, me and team, and really everybody else across the world, we were all kind of affected by COVID. We wanted to kind of take advantage of a lot of people just doing some research, a lot of people looking around and trying to understand what this is. So I thought, this would be a great opportunity to drive traffic to my site. So what we did is we created a piece of content just explaining what COVID is. We've had it up on the site for 7, 8, 9 months now, and we're not receiving really any traffic whatsoever. Could you walk me through why that possibly could be?
Sure. I think a couple of things that I'm hearing here, right, is you were first inclined to write about COVID because it was really topical. But can you tell me, how did you write about COVID? Were you targeting questions? Were you talking about your business at all? How this piece of content, like what were you specifically targeting related to COVID?
Well, what we kind of determined was we went on Google Trends. We saw like everyone is searching around the topic of coronavirus. So what we just wanted to make sure we did was we got a piece of content up on the site as quickly as possible. So not really doing a lot of research behind it, but we just want to make sure we got a piece of content up on the site that just goes into what COVID is and like how it's affecting everybody across the world right now.
Got it. Okay. So something great that you mentioned is that you were able to get a piece of responsive content up there, right? Which is definitely a component of creating content and making sure that you're a thought leader within your industry. What I'm also hearing is that there wasn't much research done prior to this piece of content being created. How might that have, you think, impacted what you've written about? And have you considered that?
No, it's not something we consider at all, Mari. It's something that we just wanted to make sure we got that piece of content up on the site as quickly as possible. Are you telling me that keyword research is something that is important when creating new content?
I would definitely say that keyword research is the beginning phases of creating a good piece of content. And as we'll talk a little bit more about that in future conversations, we'll also kind of dig a little bit deeper into something that you also maybe didn't address, which was the kind of content you're creating and the audience that your brand has, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I appreciate you kind of being very candid about your process building that so that we could get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you. So kind of coming back to being our normal selves, both of us being SSMs, you can see that some of what we just spent some time on was assessing how this piece of content was created and the process that was utilized before it was published. Please, in the chat, another quick question for all of you. If you can list some of the ways that Zach, in this example, could have better prepared this piece of content, or maybe what he should have been writing about. See a couple, Christy Dillman. Glad that this example is pertinent. No research, Anthony Melvin. Yep, definitely. Any other thoughts on some of the ways that he could have been? Yep, competitor analysis. Eileen, perfectly said. Relevancy, another big target word, buzzword, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good job. Good job, Lindsay and Tony, connecting COVID to sporting goods. It's a really good call out as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Elaine, the same thing. Better angle, how the COVID info for how it would affect our customers specifically. That's all awesome stuff.
It looks like everybody's kind of read our minds, Zach, and where we're going with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome.
EAT, amazing reference. Yep, that's great. Thank you all so much for contributing in the chat. It sounds like you're definitely following along in terms of where we're trying to lead the conversation. Definitely thinking about this in terms of how we might address content moving forward, and especially topical information, creating relevant pieces of content. I know that that's been something that continues to show up in the chat today. But relevant is a little bit based on your own individual industry, right? Somebody else mentioned competitor analysis, so leveraging all of that. And all of it ties perfectly into what we've created, which are the five-step process to supercharging your content. So what we're going to look at here, and many of you have already alluded to our list, but the first step is going to be determining your topic. The second is going to be understanding the influence of your brand's audience on that content. Identifying your competitors, some of you called that out, so well done. Obviously implementing what we know of SEO best practices and evaluating your performance. So we're going to jump into each of these individually, and to kick it off, we're going to check out determining your topic.
Awesome. So determining your topic. What we always want to make sure we're doing when we start creating a piece of content is doing our keyword research. I'm so pumped that we saw that again and again and again in the chat, because it really is super important to make sure there are actually people searching around your topic. The last thing we want to do is spend our very valuable hours creating a piece of content, making sure it's SEO friendly, checking dotting all of our T's, dotting all of our T's, dotting all of our I's and crossing our T's, only to find out there's really no one searching around the topic we've created our piece of content around. It is super important, super times infinity, that we make sure that we are doing our keyword research. Specifically, where this becomes even more valuable is doing keyword research and understanding how people are searching on Google. We want to make sure that people are searching for the topic that we are creating content around, and we're actually using words that people are using in search. This way we can use those words throughout our piece of content and always make sure that we are doing that keyword research. So I do have a quick poll for folks on the line. So I'm going to see if it actually works and add it in right now, but I just kind of want to get an understanding of how many of you do keyword research before your content is created. So if that has populated, please tell me if it has. Go ahead and fill that out.
Amazing, they're rolling in.
Liz going what that means sometimes. I like that. Yeah, we'll give that a couple more minutes. Or a couple more seconds, I should say.
Thank you, Dan. I couldn't agree more with you there. Oh, that's amazing, Katie. I love to hear that. Katie said we even have Explorer up while brainstorming content so we can do real-time keyword research. That's a great concept. Awesome. Okay, it looks like our poll has kind of settled down a bit.
Awesome. And this is something, again, always make sure you're doing key research to understand, one, is your topic relevant? And two, how people are searching around that topic. Great.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you, Zach. So thinking about the second step within the 5-step process after determining your topic, right, utilizing keyword research in a number of different ways, is understanding your audience. So in this example, we took the search interest between hockey sticks and mozzarella sticks to identify a very clear difference in intent when we think about who we're writing to. And you can see very clearly here the kinds of audience and customers and consumers that would be interested in these different kinds of content. So even tying it back, right? So hockey sticks, kind of going with our example of Zach pretending to be that e-commerce person at a sports equipment site. We wanted to kind of compare that to a slightly different topic. But even when we think about it in terms of, right, he was writing about COVID, but he didn't take into account his audience cares more about sports and COVID, how COVID might have impacted the industry that he's selling his products in, right? And so we really take into account the different levels of intent, as well as who the audience of your brand is, should really influence and determine the kind of content that you create, and certainly the approach that you take as well, even when you consider the demographics of your audience. So definitely something to consider, and certainly something that as you expand upon your research, you'll want to continue to inject at all stages of your content creation.
And then I know this is something that had been hit on in the chat quite a bit, but you always want to make sure you're identifying your competitors. And there are a couple of different ways we can use the data. Again, this is a feature in Searchlight to bring about and supercharge the content that we are creating. First, we want to understand who is ranking for the topic that we are trying to write about, right? Something that I'm sure a bunch of people have run into, especially during the pandemic, and thinking back to the example we talked about earlier was, is this topic of coronavirus, right? Who is ranking for that keyword? When you think about it and you do that, and you do that research and you identify who your competitors are, while you may think there are different competitors, there are different domains ranking for a keyword that you're trying to rank for, you need to understand the difference between SEO competitors, business competitors, and top rankers, right? If I am a e-commerce sports store and I'm writing about a coronavirus, I'm writing a coronavirus content piece, I may think that there is, that my main competitors like a Modell's or Dick's Sporting Goods or other sports themed domains or websites would be ranking on that SERP, but it's actually going to be more of your FDA, your CDC, more relevant organizations to that keyword, just because those are the most relevant domains that Google is going to be serving up, right? So you want to understand, like, hey, look, are our competitors talking about this topic, or is this something that our competitors are not ranking at all for? Additionally, what you should be aware of is what kind of content is ranking for this particular topic. Are you seeing more video results? Are you seeing more long form content? Is it going to be more landing pages? Is it more blog posts? These are all things you should consider when you are creating your new content, so you can match what Google is identifying as the top ranking piece of content on the SERP.
Amazing. Thanks, Zach. Moving on to our fourth point out of the 5-step process is implementing SEO best practices. Now, as many of you know, there are a myriad of different ways that you can optimize effective content. But in terms of thinking about this from a bit of a high level and where we can start to inject what we know has direct impact on our overall ranking and organic visibility are some things like the metadata, right? So title tags, meta description, header tags, all places where we want to make sure that you're leveraging the research and the consumer voice when you can and where you can. So when we think about some of these different pieces of metadata, think of them as your first impression, right? Especially in terms of customer retention, as well as gaining new customers, right? We talk a lot about thought leadership. To Zach's earlier point, you have to be aware of what already shows up on the SERP. And you need to also be aware of how well those other domains, those other pieces of content are sending signals to Google and making it easy for their consumers to find them. So you definitely want to take into account as many of these best practices as you can. And like I said, there's only so many I can show on one slide, but this is definitely where research outside of your topic and specifically within best practices can come into play. And I can see a lot of you have some great questions in the chat, so we'll make sure to address these as well as we get into the later portion of this presentation. So we'll jump into step number 5 now.
Definitely. And once you, and honestly, once you've done all these steps, what you're going to want to make sure you do is track your performance, right? Making sure we're not just creating content just to create content. Make sure we're creating content to achieve our overarching business goals, right? Did we set our goals? Did this content satisfy our goals? Are we getting the sessions that we wanted to get out? Are we getting the sessions we wanted to get out of this piece of content? Are we getting the conversion that we wanted to get out of this content? Something that I see happen all the time that certainly can be frustrating to me, and I'm sure other SSMs and really anybody in the SEO community, right, is launching a piece of content just to launch it, right? It's like, hey, great, we got down the pipeline, it's done. We kind of shoot it live, and then we don't talk about it ever again. We always want to make sure we are tracking our content just so we can align that to our overall strategy, wherever that may be. So always make sure we're continuing to keep track of the content that we launch and make sure that we are aiming that against our goals.
Amazing. One additional thing I'll layer over the top in terms of evaluating your performance is actually ties back to the third step in the 5-step process, which is identifying those competitors, right? When you think about evaluating your performance, it's not just where do we rank in general, there is also that component of where do we rank against these other types of competitors, right? Wins can kind of show up in many different ways and in many different places. And so truly making sure you have that scope in your performance and also who you can compare yourself against for some learning opportunity, you'll really be able to further develop that piece of content and continue to make these optimizations that will make a piece of content live forever, right? That's kind of the point with SEO, is that it's always on. And we want to make sure that we continue to implement this process and implement the best practices moving forward, not just when you write a piece of content, publish and leave it, right? But we do want to make sure that it's something that's considered moving forward. So what's next? I know a lot of you have some great questions that I can see are popping up in the chat. So we're going to try and make sure to get to all of those as well. But in terms of thinking about content creation, either a net new piece of content or optimization, what is the first step after today, right? I'm hoping that this has started at least an internal conversation. And if you have a team that's larger than just you, you definitely want to take a look at your current content creation process in terms of lead time, right? In terms of the process it takes to determine a topic, the process that it takes to get approval and get something like a new piece of content or even changes to a piece of content published and made live on the site. Again, to talk about your internal process is also getting more buy-in. So there was a ton of great conversation yesterday on day one of C3 around SEO being like a team sport. And I definitely could not agree more in terms of how you can kind of get more buy-in and where other people can help support your process as well. But again, people will need to have better context on what all of that means. And then of course, the final step is get creating, right? Let's dive into keyword research. Let's get more stakeholders involved. As you do all of these steps, where are there opportunities for you to change a little bit of your process or improve it to kind of see the rewards there. Any other thoughts on that, Zach, before we jump to the next portion?
No, you're a much smarter person than me, so I think you covered it.
That's hardly true. I think I just maybe talked too much. Great. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just make sure that we have enough time for this next portion. So we're going to jump into the Q&A. I see a couple of you have already, let's see, asked a couple of questions, but if you don't mind dropping in the Q&A portion, some off the top of your head. Allison Hooks, what content goals should we have? What KPIs should we track? I think that's a phenomenal question, right? I think as we look back at kind of the what's next portion of this presentation, it's assessing your current content creation process. I would definitely say that what that looks like in terms of, again, that reassessment piece, identifying the goals, is figuring out what your current performance looks like. How much can you expect to gain from publishing a new piece of content? What KPIs do you already have? And what's your industry, right? I think, as we've pointed out, an e-commerce site might be different than like the FDA, for example. And that was our comparison with the sporting goods site versus the FDA when they write about COVID. So your question about what content goals should we have kind of ties back to your industry and also your current internal process as well as your KPIs. But you definitely want to look at it from a visits or sessions perspective in terms of organic traffic. So it's always great to start there.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for adding your questions in the Q&A section. I'm actually going to address the question that Katie K put in right here. I apologize. I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name, so I will butcher it. But Katie's asking, are there certain workflows we can establish to identify opportunities to refresh and re-optimize existing content? So where I would start, obviously, coming from Conductor and using Searchlight every single day, Searchlight has great capabilities to do this because we are integrating your analytics, and we can very quickly see if you have poor performing content that hasn't really been receiving organic traffic for a long period of time. If you haven't been using Searchlight, I would say going into GA and taking a look at your published content that has really not been receiving really any organic traffic or very low organic traffic, and then prioritizing those pages and taking a look and kind of walking them through those 5 steps. Did we do keyword research for this topic? Did we make sure we were following SEO best practices? Did we publish this piece of content? Did we take a look at competitors, right? Did we publish this piece of content? Did we track it afterwards? Those are all things you can apply to re-optimizing and refreshing existing content. So thanks so much, Katie.
Amazing. I'd like to just address a question from Lauren Moretto. I saw it in the regular chat as well, so definitely want to make sure to get to you. What are your favorite ways to lower the bounce rate? So I love this question. I think that definitely considering your click-through rate and making improvements in that is something that can feed into improving or lowering your bounce rate. And one of the ways that I often recommend addressing that is assessing the content that either has no meta descriptions or not very descriptive meta descriptions, because although meta descriptions are not a specific ranking factor to Google, they do help consumers understand what they can expect of the content they're about to click into, right, from the SERP. So if you can improve your meta description to be more aptly descriptive of your content. If you can really tie it to the overall theme. I know we only have so many characters there, but as best as you can, that's definitely one of the most, I wouldn't say easy. Creating content is never easy, but one of the quickest processes in terms of addressing content that doesn't have descriptions in place, or just descriptions that are not doing a very good job of truly describing the content people can expect to see. So that would be my first step there.
Cool. And then I will tackle this question from Asia. How do you emphasize SEO content with a team of content creators and writers with a workflow already in place? How do you train in SEO for others? That's a great question, right? SEO is something that you don't really learn overnight, and it does take some time to learn it. SEO is a large industry, right? And there's a lot of factors you consider when you want your piece of content to rank on Google. But what I would do is try to make it as simple as possible and keep content writers focused on what they can actually affect, which is on-page SEO, right? Something that I like to do when I have a large content team is to put them in charge of their own content and also keep them updated on how their content is performing. I've worked with a bunch of writers. Something that I've learned about writers is they always want to make sure that their content is being found and being seen, right? They're not writing this just for no reason. They're writing so they can get eyes on their own content. So making sure letting them know if they follow SEO best practices, their content will be found and it will be seen. And maybe, I know this is something that Christy had talked about earlier, but just putting them in charge of their own content, making sure they're understanding how their content's performing would go a long way. So thank you for that question, Asia.
Amazing. We've got a couple others. I just want to try and get to as many. DeMarco Moore asked, what does it mean when conversions don't reflect the numbers of views and clicks? And that's a really interesting question, right? I think very similar to the first question we addressed, there is a component of like understanding your industry and what you can expect of your audience. How large is your audience? How much intent is there for either the products that you're selling or the white papers you're writing, right? And the information people are looking for. So in some ways it does require looking back into the metrics that you have in terms of like those successful conversions. So I definitely think that there is a component of reassessing current performance in terms of the metrics that you've set out. So kind of tying it back to that first question again, really determining, what you can expect of your performance from within your industry. So I would always take a look right at that and doing some research in the space as well.
Cool. Awesome. So I am going to answer Jessica's question. Knowing things often move quickly and briefs can sometimes be an afterthought. If there were 3 things that would help guide an article, what key information would you provide a writer? This is a really good question, and thank you for asking it, Jessica. The 3 things that I would provide a writer: making sure they have done keyword research and doing keyword research. So even making it more simple than that, making sure they have a primary keyword, right? When we think about what are people doing is they are putting in a keyword to get search results. So making sure that a writer has a primary keyword that are holding above everything else is certainly very important. And I think just as far as building off that, making sure that that primary keyword is included in, your most important metadata, right? Your title tag, your H1. It's always surprising how often you see a great piece of content that's just not well optimized. So making sure we have that primary keyword that is included in our title tag, in our H1. We have tertiary keywords in our H2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s. It does go a long way and it is important. So just making sure they have that kind of structure to create that piece of content, they're always keeping that primary keyword in mind, would be my best piece of advice there, Jessica. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. We've got another question here from Patrick Bernard. Hope I'm saying that correctly. Essentially, it's a longer question. So essentially, what is our take on optimizing past press releases for SEO. I'm actually going to expand that question to be like past created pieces of content. Are there recommended thresholds in terms of time? So how old, right? And I love that question. I think it goes back to what we know of SEO, which is that if you stand up a good piece of content, if you work to improve a piece of content, there really shouldn't be a shelf life associated with it. Now, if it is extremely topical, right? Ideally, people are not writing about the life that we're living in COVID and even the matter of the next few months. But I imagine the next couple of years where it's not going to be as important a topic, I would hope, in terms of, how much all of our lives has changed. But if there is something that continues to be important, if there is a way to refresh the content in terms of there's new information, right? You always want to make sure that you're on top of updating that information and what people can expect of it. And that isn't just the content on the page. That is going to be stuff like your metadata. It is going to be stuff like if it were a press release, obviously recirculating that too. So there are some components to different pieces of content, but aside from it being hyper focused on one topic that might have now passed us by, I would definitely recommend looking at your content and finding ways to optimize it with new information. And that's one of the quickest ways to address that.
Awesome. And Kirsten Ford is asking, do you have any advice on improving the SERP position for content, particularly optimized for feature snippets? Yeah, really good question, Kirsten. I would say the biggest piece of advice I can give as it relates to feature snippets is making sure they exist for the keywords that we're targeting. Something that we're not going to be able to do or something that we're not going to be able to do, or if you can do this, please let me know, and then we can all get very, very rich, is force Google to put a feature snippet on a particular SERP for a particular keyword, right? If there is not an answer box on a feature, on a SERP for a particular keyword, we're not going to force Google to put that answer box there. What we want to make sure we're doing is choosing keywords that already have feature snippets. I know I'm using answer boxes a lot, but the same goes for, video carousels, image results, all those universal search results. We're not going to force Google to publish them on a SERP. So when we do discover a keyword that has a feature snippet on the SERP, that's the keyword we want to target to get onto the SERP for that feature snippet. There's actually also a really good feature in Searchlight called Result Types that helps folks identify what feature snippets are appearing for the keywords that we're tracking. So that's the way that I would go about capturing these feature snippets. Thank you for your question, Kirsten.
Great, thanks, Zach. Next question here is from Timothy Saravallo. I really appreciate this question. So how effective is content that relates to current events such as the Chauvin verdict? Our audience is looking for businesses that are socially aware and involved in the community. The latter part of that question, our audience is looking for businesses socially aware and involved in the community. I would say yes. And the keyword research isn't, you would look obviously just for, a particular person on trial or a particular event that's happened. This actually ties back to an earlier point that Zach had brought up, which is what content already exists on the SERP for something you're considering writing about. If you even just Googled his name, you're going to see a ton of news results. You're going to see a ton of Twitter, like the Twitter feed, right? The Twitter carousel. So when you think about writing for a piece of content, it's not always as simple as saying, I'm going to write about X topic. It's considering why might this be valuable? So even, businesses that are socially aware, you could make a Google search for that. Within keyword research, you could look up environmental sustainability. You could look up for racial justice, right? Those are all supplemental topics to the overall theme that I think you're asking about. And so even though that's not the keyword or the topic, it should target some of these additional supplemental keywords as well. And so keyword research, both leveraging a platform like Conductor or even leveraging just the SERP, can be helpful in making that determination. So thank you for that question.
All righty. And Past and Sellers is asking, if customers don't immediately convert from a page, how do you show value in customer relationships and downstream actions? Yeah, definitely. I mean, in an ideal world, every piece of content that we create is going to result in, millions of conversions. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, right? So I think the first thing to understand is taking a look at that piece of content. If it is receiving traffic, understanding why are people not converting on this page. Heat mapping is something that I encourage people to do just so they can understand where people are clicking on the page. And if I've had things where it's as simple as like, hey, look, we have no call to action on this page, so that's why people are converting. So sometimes it really can be that simple as understanding like, hey, look, do we have a call to action? Is it obvious? Are people, if it's not obvious, can we make it more obvious? And making sure we're driving people to continue, like you said, to go downstream. As far as, showing value in customer relationships, that's a bit of a tricky one, just because it's not really that as clean cut of a metric. But something I might refer to is time on page, trying to understand and seeing how long people are spending on a piece of content you've created, and making a decision based on that if we do need to re-optimize or repurpose that page. But really good, interesting, and tough question, Pax. I'd be happy to follow up with you via email on that one.
Perfect. Thanks, Zach. Okay, last question here from Julius Francis. Does SEO apply to social media content in the same way, or is it not apples to apples in that sense? It isn't. So social media, right? That's very expansive. And even just as I hear social media, I think Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of these different apps, right? Or apps that exist for these different platforms. It's not directly apples to apples. Something that could be interesting, and we don't have the time today, but something for you to consider taking a further look into is things like app store optimizations, in just terms of how people engage with either your company's app, ways that these other applications are optimizing. And in terms of publishing content, you do want to make sure that when you link back to the ideally landing page that you have on your site, all of those keywords do support each other, right? You wouldn't want to write a piece of content, link to it in a social media post, and those two not be as related, as they should be. That could ultimately end up hurting you in the long run. So if there is anything to say about the overlap between creating content for the organic space and social media, is you want to make sure that they are relevant in terms of connectivity. And we are just up at time. Trying to see if there are any last questions here. Thank you all so much for joining our session this afternoon. It's tough not seeing everyone's faces. I know that you can see ours, but we're so appreciative of you all taking the time to join us. And please do follow up with questions. We'll do our best to do the same. So thank you so much.